So far, we've looked at control flow changes using if statements. There's another very popular form of control flow called a loop, and there are many different forms of loops. The loop that we're going to look at first is called the for-in loop. It's very commonly referred to as a for loop in many languages, but the syntax is a little different in Swift, and I like it because it's, I think, actually easier to understand and code. So let's jump in and check out the for-in loop. The topics we're going to cover for the for-in loop are three. First is what is a loop, because this will be the first time we'll encounter that. The second is how do we declare specifically the for-in loop, which is unique to Swift but very powerful. And third is to look at loop scope and just talk a little bit about the scope associated with loops. So for-in loops use ranges to determine how we're going to go through a loop and how often we go through the loop. And ranges come in many different forms, and Swift allows for a lot of versatility here. However, we're going to focus specifically on numerical ranges to start with. Those are the easiest to understand and get our heads wrapped around. And then as we get into more complicated data structures throughout the course, we can look at how for-in loops can work on those data structures as well. So there's basically three types of numerical ranges that we can specify in a for-in loop. The first is, for example, a beginning value and an ending value, and then all of the values in between. So when we're dealing with integers, as an example, and this doesn't work for floats because floats would have sort of an infinite precision, if you will. But with integers, we can easily say, look, let's start at 0 and let's end at 6. And we want all the values in between as well. So this is how we specify that, which is basically we start with the starting value here, we have the ending value here, and then this ... says start with this number and end with this value inclusive. So basically it's 0 through 6. Now, the second way to specify it is basically the same start and end numbers, but notice here we have this less than sign. And that less than sign means go up to, but do not include the 6th value. So in essence, we're going to go 0 through 5. And then finally, there's another one called stride. So what this is a function, and we haven't gotten into defining functions yet, but I think you can kind of get a feel for the syntax here. We have a name with an open paren, and then we have 3 arguments here that we can supply. So one of them says from, so the way it reads, we can just read it and go, oh, it's going to start at 0, and then it's going to go to 15. So it'd be very much like having a 0 here and a 15 here. But notice this is incrementing by 1, and that's the default. So for stride, we can actually change the by to be by a different value. So by saying 0 to 15 by 5, we actually have a range that goes 0, 5, 10, and 15. So this is a way we're going to specify the values that are going to be used in our loop on each iteration of the loop. So let's look at the actual declaration of the syntax of a for-in loop. First of all, it does start with the for, F-O-R, keyword. And so you can't have variables just named for. This would be a reserved word in Swift. And this is how you're going to start out your for loop, with the word for. At the next step, we're going to have the variable. So here we have the variable n. That could be any value you wanted it to be. So we can name it whatever we want. But the idea is that this variable is going to be visible in this scope, which we'll talk about a little more in a minute. And this n is going to take on the values that are in this range. So that's the variable. And then third is the keyword in. So it's always, this is why we call it a for-in loop. We're starting with for, we have the variable name in, and then we're going to specify the range next. So this is saying that n is going to go from 1 through 5 inclusive because of the ... And finally, we're going to finish our for loop with an open bracket and a close bracket. And what these brackets do, very much like the if statement, is they define a scope that is part of the loop. So any statements that we put in here between this bracket and this bracket, so in this loop, we're going to iterate over and over from 1 through 5. So we'll actually do 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So we iterate through this loop 5 times, and then we fall out, and then we continue down here on any statements that are after the loop. And anything that's inside these brackets is going to be part of this iteration that increments every time. And also this variable n is scoped within this section right here. So n is defined in here. So we could refer to n in a calculation, we could print it out, we could do any number of things here. But after the scope ends right here, n is no longer visible. So n cannot be referred to after the loop any more than it can be referred to before the loop. Again, n is only visible inside the loop. So what statements might we use n for? So there's a statement, again, I would ask the students what if there are any statements they can think of that they've used so far. So they've done some arithmetic operations at this point. They've also used the print statement, and print statement's probably one of the most obvious ones. So in that scenario, we could actually print n here. And so this would be a great exercise for the students to fire up either the playground or fire up Replit and go ahead and enter this code into it and watch what happens. And they should see 1 through 5 printed out. Now, also using what we've learned to date, what if we wanted to write a program that actually calculated the sum of all numbers between 1 and 20 inclusive, that's the key word here, and it prints out the result. So again, in this case, I would break up into teams, 2 or 3, and have them work together to see if they can come up with the algorithm or the method to do this. And what I'll do at this point is show you kind of what the solution should look like. So we know, first of all, we said here that the program is going to sum all the numbers between 1 and 20 inclusive. So that is a key right there, that it's probably a for-in loop. So we have this for-in loop that goes from 1 to 20. And notice we have the 3 dots, which means it's inclusive. So it's going to do 1 and 20. And that's what we want. We want to get all of those values. Now, the thing is that we needed to create the sum of all of them. So we have to remember that sum. We have to have that box. So essentially, we're going to declare a variable that actually is going to keep track of our sum. And our sum starts out before we even do the loop as 0. So again, we've declared the variable. We've called it sum. You could call it whatever you want. Gets the value of 0, and that starts out an initialization for the sum variable. And then we still have our loop here. So now we have to do something inside the loop to add up all these numbers. So again, any thoughts about what that might be? If the teams have sort of worked on this already, they probably have a suggestion. So this is my suggestion, which would be, say, sum, and use one of these compound operators and assignments. So we say plus equals n. What this should do is it should keep taking n and adding it to sum. The other possibility would be to say sum equals sum plus n. You could do that as well. Both of those are valid. And this will create a sum that keeps going up based on every iteration in the loop. Finally, when the loop is done, we can print the sum out. Notice the sum was declared here and therefore is still part of the scope of this. N is only part of the scope of the for loop. So we couldn't print n out here, although we've already run through the loop at this point, so it doesn't even make sense to do that. But n is not part of the scope once we get here, but sum is. So we could print out the sum. So again, I would leave this open to the students to work out through the playground and through Replit. So given what we know, what if we wanted to say we wanted to go between the numbers 1 and 20 as opposed to inclusive between 1 and 20? So this is kind of just a range question. So again, what do students think that range value should be? And so the right answer here is, well, we don't want it to include 1. It was supposed to be between 1 and 2, 1 and 20. So we can say 2 here. But then we can use 20 and we can use the less than sign, which says up to but not including 20. And that would be correct. All right. There are other options. So for example, this is also correct. 2 ... 19 is also in between 1 and 20. But then you would need to say inclusive of these two values to be between 1 and 20. So another question is, could var have been a let? The answer would be, well, lets are constants. And the point of it is that the value should never change. So why would this not work? So the question, again, for the students is, if I look at this, why can this not be a let? And the answer to that is because it's being modified. Once it's set to 0, this would be considered illegal because we're changing the value of sum over the iterations of the loop. And we've set up here that our contract with the compiler is that let never changes, or sum never changes. So if sum never changes and then you do it here, that's not going to be legal. So our compiler, friendly compiler, would come in and say that's a compilation error. So we've covered in for in looping, what a loop is. We've covered how do we declare the for in loop. So we've gone through the syntax and we've looked at loop scope.